Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Hunt Institute webinar focusing on teacher retention, supporting the wellness and well-being of our teachers. And we're going to focus today on our teachers of color and figuring out what strategies, experiences that we need to create to ensure that we retain those teachers to get into our classrooms. Here today, we have an extraordinary panel, which I will introduce in a moment. But before we do that, I want to briefly talk about the Hunt Institute, why we do this work, and why we bring great resource experts like the one you see before you today together. The Hunt Institute focuses specifically on bringing policy and education and merging those things together. So we really focus how we can lift up the experiences of educators and merging those experiences and creating the audience with our policymakers. So really bridging that gap and that divide between policy and the actual teaching practice itself. And so today we have an extraordinary panel today of folks who run the spectrum of education, from professors to researchers, to folks who have really done work as educators and grown as consultants as well, and really have touched and grown a large variety of folks across the spectrum of education. So specifically, we have a great folks. I'll be with you for just a short moment, but our moderator for this afternoon, who kind of guide you through the rest of this journey, is Dr. Davis Dixon, who's an assistant professor at Howard University. We have Dr. Amber Ravenel, who's the National Research Manager at Teach Plus. We have Ronald Rapatalo, who is an associate partner in business development and client relations at Stronger Consulting, and Dr. Gio Gracias, who is the research director at a place I love, Breakthrough Collaborative, as well. And so this session is really going to be focused on today, thinking about the pandemic and how it burned so many student teachers out. And then we saw the dramatic teacher shortages, mental health issues, lower academic performance. And we realized that to alleviate back to school stress, students had an academic decline for the pandemic. And we know that. But we're going to be focused today, not necessarily on those issues and the problems that we've kind of exhausted the conversation at times, but we're focusing on those proven strategies that schools can implement to protect and really value the mental, physical, and emotional health and well-being of their communities. So you'll join those great folks that I just introduced briefly as they discuss the benefits of building school communities that promote mental health, but also encourage mindfulness practices and foster well-being to improve school culture and educator retention. And so I'm excited to turn it over to Dr. Dixon, who is, again, an assistant professor of development and psychology at the prestigious Howard University. And his research has really explored, creating safe, welcoming school environments to affirm an identity, humanity, and culture. And also, under his umbrella, he's really interested in exploring the cultural identity of students across school types and really think about how that can predict student academic outcomes as a function of those perceptions of mattering, belonging, and trust, and exploring the match and mismatch between student and teacher perceptions of climate. And so we're excited to have Dr. Dixon moderate as well. He also worked at EdTrust as a researcher in the pre-K through 12 space as well. So he does have that pre-K 12 experience as well as his higher ed degrees from Howard, as well as North Carolina Central University here, which is local to us here. So without further ado, Dr. Dixon, thank you so much. I will turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Jarvis. Thanks so much to the Hunt Institute for having me as a moderator for this panel. Thank you to our panelists for joining today. And of course, thank you, all of you attendees participating with us today. So just to kick it off, I will quickly ask all of our panelists to introduce yourselves and just share a little bit about why mental health, mindfulness, and well-being are important for you. And let's, in order to not have like the weird silence between people trying to figure out who to go first, let's go, G, you want to go first?
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Dixon. Hi, everyone. My name is Gio Gracias. I use she, her pronouns. And I'm currently the Senior Director of Research and Evaluation with an organization called Breakthrough Collaborative. I've spent my whole career in the education space. My first full-time job was being an elementary band teacher in the school district that I grew up in. I'm also a mother of two children who both attend public schools, and They have both helped shape how I think about schooling from a parent perspective now, and particularly when I think about education for like the whole child and well-being. A little bit about Breakthrough. So Breakthrough's been around for over 40 years. We are a network of 25 different affiliates from across the country. We offer year-round programming where we serve about 10,000 students every year who are traditionally underrepresented in higher education. They come to us as middle schoolers. We support them throughout high school on their path to college. And our cornerstone program is our 6-week summer program, where our middle schoolers receive academics, they receive mentorships, they go on field trips, they build connection and relationships, they have a lot of fun, they find a lot of joy. And for that program, we recruit, train, and support over 1,000 college students who we call teaching fellows to teach in our near peer mentoring model. And so one of our key interests at Breakthrough is diversifying the teacher pipeline and profession. And we find that in about any given year, 75% of our teaching fellows identify as a person of color. And what we found in our last alumni survey, teaching fellow alumni survey, is that over half, 52% of our teaching fellows go on to become teachers in the field, and 80% of them actually go on to work in the field of education. And so one of the reasons out of many of why we at Breakthrough are interested in well-being and mindfulness and mental health is that honestly, sometimes it feels kind of tricky to have the goal of increasing diversity in the teacher pipeline when we know that schools can actually be harmful spaces for individuals, and particularly individuals of color. And that's why we do the programming that we do. And that's why we run our programming in very identity affirming ways as well. And I'm excited to share some of our strategies with everyone here today. So thank you all for the invitation and looking forward to this panel.
Great, thank you. Ron, let's kick it to you.
Thank you, Dr. Dixon. Hi, everyone. Ron Rapatalo. A little bit about me first. I love the way that you started that, because I was going to go right into like work and like why mindfulness and all this stuff. Like a little bit about myself. A child of Philippine immigrants, youngest is 7, born and raised in New York City. So the Knicks winning tonight hopefully will be a part of my own personal well-being, or hopefully not. If they lose tonight, I'm going to be quite sad. But nonetheless, I've been in the K-12 education sector for 20 years. Like I always kid around, every good Filipino was destined for medical school, disappointed my mom and not applying to medical school. So went through a couple different career transitions before I started working in K-12 education. In summer of 3 at Teach for America. Didn't do the core, but worked there, and have been 20 years in and around schools, particularly on the human capital talent acquisition side. So fast forward, I'm at Stronger Consulting. We are a search and consulting firm in the social impact space with a large footprint in K-12 education. So we work with charters, districts, nonprofits, and we believe in making sure we're impacting kids and communities, particularly of color, to make sure they have the right leaders as well as the kind of right strategies and resources to affect change. So I talk to a lot of school leaders. Personally, I think why mental health, mindfulness, and well-being is important to me is multi-layered, right? Because I think one of the things I've learned is that our own willpower is quite limited. And so therefore the system environment that is created that you opt into dictates a lot of what kind of things that you do, particularly around how you access mental health, mindfulness, and well-being, right? And so the systems thinking, especially in supporting school leaders and hearing of school leaders that are either focusing on that or unfortunately for various reasons, not focusing on it, I think what Mike and I and our team at Strong Consulting watch is that could be a make or break about whether a school leader and an educator stays in a school system or a nonprofit, right? And so those things I think are less paid attention to. And so I think my role here is to share some of those stories and anecdotes and things that I've heard over the last 20 years, but acutely, especially in the age of COVID, what I've heard in talking to school leaders in various different frames. I'm not a practitioner, but I do bring, I think, a personal level of seeing my own family deal with mental health issues over the last, since my upbringing. So mental health and dealing with it, understanding it, has always just been deeply personal to me because it's just always been in front of me. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, and then last but not least, of course, Amber.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Dixon. Actually, I'm a fellow Bison as well, so it's good to see other Howard students and grads on the call. I, like many on this call, am a former teacher, and so when I think about the importance of mental health, thinking back to my time in the classroom, I actually wish I had paid more attention both to my own mental health and the mental health of my students. So I'm really excited to be here to have this conversation with everyone today. I am on the research team at Teach Plus. We are a national teacher leadership organization with the mission of empowering diverse, excellent, and experienced educators to take leadership on policy issues and practice issues in their school across the country. We work both nationally and with our 12 regions. And in particular, on the research side of things, we really focus on elevating the perspectives of teachers and lots of policy and practice issues, including teacher diversity. A lot of our national and regional work has been in how we can recruit and retain diverse educators. And as part of that conversation, and I'll share a little bit more later, mental health comes up quite a bit. So I'm excited to share some of our learnings with you and as well talk about strategies with the other amazing panelists. So thank you.
Great, thanks you all. And so I'll kick it back to Amber for our first official question of the day. So Teach Plus has done a lot of amazing work and research around the importance of retention, right? And particularly, of course, for educators of color. So could you tell us some about the power of having these school environments that support the mental health, mindfulness, and the well-being of its educators?
Yeah, thank you for that question. That's a great question. It's definitely so important to think about school culture and school environment for all educators, but particularly for educators of color. So over the past several years, Teach Plus has done a lot of research on recruiting and retaining teachers of color in partnership with EdTrust. One of our first reports, If You Listen, We Will Stay, really asked educators of color across the country, why is it that educators of color are leaving their classrooms and their schools? What is driving those high turnover rates that we know exist for teachers of color? So we, as I mentioned, do our research and talking to teachers and elevating their perspectives. And one of the main reasons that we kind of highlighted in our research about why teachers of color are leaving is because of negative school environments and school culture. So teachers mentioned things like experiencing really antagonistic work environments where they feel invisible, where they feel undervalued, and particularly for teachers of color, experiencing really explicit racism and bias in their schools from peers, from school leaders. And so that really has a huge impact on their desire to remain at their school or remain in the profession of teaching more generally. And so a lot of times what we heard from teachers is they may be in the minority at their school. So they might be feeling isolated, they might be feeling lonely, they might be experiencing discrimination and bias from peers or school leaders. And so they really need that support, not just for their instructional practice, but for their emotional, mental, psychological well-being. One tangible thing that we heard from educators a lot, educators of color, is how the expectations might be different in terms of their job. So they're there to teach, but might be also pulled into these kind of outside roles because they're an educator of color. For example, being responsible for supporting discipline, even being responsible for counseling students of color in particular, just based on their race and ethnicity. And so these kind of outside factors and additional kind of challenges are both challenging for them emotionally and psychologically. They're not receiving any additional support, resources, financial resources for this time. And so a lot of increased expectations and the added weight and responsibility for teachers of color. And so they experience these kind of negative school cultures and school environments, and that's driving them away from the profession. And what they're really asking for is more support and affirmation in their roles. Things like having strong mentors or other teachers of color who are maybe having similar experiences to them that they can lean on and learn from. Also having access to affinity spaces where they can kind of meet and talk to other educators of color who are in their schools or even in their districts. And some of the work that we have done at Teach Plus is kind of help teachers to foster those affinity spaces so teachers of color feel like they have a safe space to talk to their peers about what they're experiencing. And many of our regions who have done research on teacher mental health in particular have raised the need for kind of more comprehensive support. So mental health professionals in schools to help teachers deal with the challenges that they're facing, and also making sure that school leaders are really invested in creating positive environments and positive school culture so that teachers feel supported and affirmed. And so those are some of the things that we have heard in terms of educators of color and their mental health and the importance of school environments.
Got you. Great. Thank you. So G, for you, I think we all kind of can agree about like wearing so many different hats as we bring into this space. And so as someone who is a lifelong learner, a researcher, a parent, and an educator, how do you think about the importance of having this supportive school environment that not only challenges all of its students, but also focuses on the mental health and the mindfulness and well-being of its faculty and staff?
Yeah, great question. And, I think a lot of what Dr. Ravenel said really resonates with me. I will share just, my personal experience as being a former teacher a little bit. So I was an elementary band teacher for a few years right out of college. And because I was a band teacher, there weren't enough students in any given school for me to teach in just one school. So over the 3 years that I was a teacher, I taught in 7 different schools. And one of those years I taught in 4 different schools. And so it was very clear to me walking into every single building, they all felt different. And it all felt different because of the principals, the school makeup, the resources that were available. In some of the schools that I was in, I had my own classroom space and it was beautiful and I had lots of space. I even had windows. But then in some of my other schools, where space and resources were more limited, I was schlepping a giant broken up cardboard box full of wired music stands and instruments from like space to space. And, in one of my schools, the custodian had to even clear a little bit of space for me in a cafeteria closet for me to teach. And, as a first year teacher or, a new teacher, it felt incredibly demoralizing, having to try to teach children in these borrowed spaces, me having to teach and those students having to learn next to like cleaning products and mops and things like that. And, in those schools in particular, we had a high percentage of students who were also experiencing a lot of trauma outside of their school. And so, that came with a lot of its own like stresses and triggers for me as a teacher. And I would say, it was doubly hard even for me, being in a subject that was in music, which is always on the chopping block when budgets get tight too. So there's that added stress. And then on top of that, even, I was probably like the only or maybe one of 2 Asian American teachers in the building as well. So I had also another sort of unique like layer of things that I was also having to grapple with as a teacher. And so, Dr. Ravenel mentioned mentoring programs. So I was actually so thankful that there was actually a mentoring program, but it was only for my first year. And I was paired with an experienced band teacher who was from another school. And the intent of the program was not only to help increase my effectiveness as a novice teacher, but like really it was just someone for me to talk to about things that were happening both inside and outside of the classroom. And my mentor, she received a stipend. We often met during like lunch or dinner time. It definitely wasn't like an evaluative relationship. Like she could not influence like a performance rating or anything like that. So I could like speak very openly and honestly about the challenges that I was experiencing in my day-to-day. And that emotional support really helped me show up to schools feeling more supported and being a more emotionally regulated teacher. And not only that, I was able, because I was more emotionally available, I was able to be more supportive of my colleagues in the school buildings that I was in, which, obviously contributes to that overall school culture as well, because, school culture is made up of people. The mentorship program that I was in is actually coordinated by the district, but we know that like a lot of school settings have these programs. I would say it seems to me that like a lot of these programs are targeted more towards novice teachers, but it seems like these types of programs, really this like colleague to colleague support is really necessary and important for teachers at all stages of their career. Even recently I read Ed Week did a survey called the State of Teaching Survey, where they gauged teacher morale. And they found that morale dipped dramatically for those that were in their 3rd to 9th year of teaching, especially in those years where you actually really start to get into your groove and you're a really effective teacher starting to become one. And so, it could be that mentorship looks different for those that are, already in their career than like when they were in the early stages of their career. But the data showing that teachers at all levels really could benefit from the resources that really support their well-being.
Got you. Thank you. Now, Ron, as a self-proclaimed talent shepherd, right? How do you help school leaders enrich their school cultures and environments? And inside of that, what role does mental health and mindfulness and well-being have on the administrators as they are thinking about those really important factors towards teacher retention?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Dixon. It's a really great question. So I think I lead with the kind of like picture of it's harder to lead when you don't have your own oxygen mask on, right? Is it possible? Are school leaders asked to do that pre-COVID and post-COVID? Absolutely. It's a normal condition of operating, right? I would argue just the majority of our educators in public schools across America. And I think what I find when a school leader isn't focused on their own mental, like their own self-care, it's harder to be in front of folks and bring the mindset and the passion and the leadership to be able to lead the school. Because at some level, right, if I think about this emotionally, right, if you're fatigued, it's easier to get upset. Like this is all like kind of emotional intelligence stuff. If you think about this in a pragmatic manner, if you're not taking care of yourself, you haven't built the level of self-awareness that I believe mindfulness is a pathway to start to deepen. And you aren't then, doing things for yourself around, I've been going to therapy on and off for 20 plus years. Do you have access to a coach, right? I don't want to say every school system like provides that to school leaders, right? And I have found in many a model when they have access to a coach, that could be super helpful to have that space to start having a space outside of the school building to talk about those things, right? And how to formulate those things, right? Because I think if the school leader and administrator is taking care of themselves, my take is, or in parallel, like able to think about the system that their school needs so that the adults in the building can start taking care of themselves, right? And I think the one thing that I would say on that role for administrators to play in terms of accessing, what they're doing around mental health, mindfulness, and well-being is really thinking about it from the systems point of view. I think a lot of times when I hear the stories of how this all happens, right? It's like, let's have the massage day. Yeah, we're bringing people in. It's like a one-trick pony. But I think we all know on this webinar that the more root cause of it are the things that we've all talked about. Capacity of our educators to do the work. You really want to have a conversation about the 3 things we're talking about? We have to look at that from a policy level, a systems level, about how much we are asking our educators to do. Because frankly, I get really cynical about all the things you can do if we're asking folks to basically be on the Titanic. Real talk, right? And so until we start having at least school leaders and locus of control say, what is it about educator capacity that we have control over to be able to ask them to do a little bit less and focus on the things that are most required for the role? And everything could be required, right? I think we are doing a disservice to this conversation if we don't ultimately talk about that, because there are all of you on this call that are practitioners in this space. I think the strategies are out there, frankly, right? You don't want to access a strategy when you are not feeling good about yourself and you are underwater, frankly. And that's often what I hear. It's like, I want to do these things, but like I'm working 80, 90-hour weeks.
Got you. And so, and I'll kick it back to you, Ron, again for a kind of a follow-up. So given this
Yeah.
importance of us thinking about mental health and mindfulness and well-being,
Mhm.
how can school leaders begin to implement some of these evidence-based strategies that can then foster these impacts in their teachers and their students?
I mean, I think when I think about what school leaders often do, right, is they have to create kind of a what is that wellness plan for the school, right? We create instructional plans, we create a yearly plan going into the school year, right? I think the one thing that needs to be elevated, right, which I've seen there being work on. So someone like Dr. Mary Rice Booth has a book talking about the 10 competencies for leaders of color to thrive, right? That's a resource people should check out, right? Is we have to elevate wellness on the systemic level so it's planned for. Because I think all the evidence-based practices, whether it's an entity that I once was a part of, but unfortunately folded earlier this year. Like I would point people, because the website still has information, is Mindful Schools. They were doing mindfulness, work across public schools in America, right? And so there are definitely things out there that can work, right? But without there being an articulated plan that the school leader, right, and the school leader system, their manager says, you know what, wellness is elevated as part of what we're assessing you on in your school. It just, I think in the politicization and the pressure of schools on test scores, this stuff falls apart really easily, where it's like the pressure to solve for other things, wellness will then be a byproduct. And so school leaders, like now with it being May, right, as we're looking into the next school year, how are these things being planned for now, and spending time in summer PD and training to ensure that a culture of wellness and a plan is built? Because frankly, I think all of you on this call, as I said earlier, there are the strategies and practices that are out there, right? And I'm not one that's like, that's not my expertise whatsoever, but I think there are things out there that could be plugged and played based on an understanding of the unique environment of that school, right? Because not everything's going to work if you just plug and play and say, go ahead and work on meditation, but people feel some kind of way about it because sometimes meditation and mindfulness for some school communities may feel overly religious for some. Even that's not my take, right? But I think you have to meet people where they are and figure out what venues they're going to be able to access information and be able to change their practices around wellness.
Got you. Thanks. And did you have any, I guess kind of quickly as we're still moving through it, any like resources or models to share with the folks if you had any?
Mindful Schools comes to mind, even though they're no longer a nonprofit. Dr. Mary Rice Booth's book, I think, is a really good model of those competencies for leaders of color to thrive. I have a buddy in my new leaders world whose school was profiled in a webinar I did a couple of years ago, forgetting the name of the school, but his name is Paul Barnhart, Barnhrt. He ran a school where he built a culture of wellness for his school, right? And so there's probably stuff on his school website that talks about that, but I'm not remembering the name of it off the top of my head.
Gotcha. Cool. Thank you. And so we already got a couple questions coming into the chat. And just to remind you all, please continue to do so. Submit your questions, and we'll definitely have time for at the end of the session to do a lot of dialoguing for those questions. So I'll kick it back to Amber for this next one. If teachers are the most important like in-school factor for success for students, is there any research out there that talks about the impact of positive school cultures that support student outcomes?
Yeah, there absolutely is. And, students, of course, are part of the school culture and the school ecosystem. So having a positive school environment does impact their ability to learn and other non-academic outcomes as well. So Learning Policy Institute has some work on this, but basically, yeah, having a positive school culture can help improve academic outcomes for students, like test scores, graduation rates, and attendance, and some non-academic outcomes too as well, like decreased instances of violence and disciplinary incidents, as well as like bullying and things like that. So having a good school culture benefits teachers, and it has direct impacts to student outcomes as well. And although Teach Plus, like we usually do research with teachers, we recently did our first kind of entry into research where we talked to students. So we did some focus groups with students of color. We're trying to understand, what can we do to like help us understand why students of color are either drawn to teaching or they're like deterred from teaching. And through that research, we actually heard something that I think maybe was surprising to us. So students are actually students of color are thinking about almost the exact same things in terms of environment or having a positive school environment as their teachers. So they are really paying attention to how their teachers are being treated, and also really like noting the environment around them, and that's helping them decide whether or not they're able to learn and whether they might want to return to schools as teachers in the future. So really raising things like experiencing microaggressions in their schools, not having good relationships with their teachers or their school leaders is really having a negative impact on their environment. And then also a part of, if we're particularly talking about students of color, having a positive school environment has to do with like cultural responsiveness or cultural affirmation. And so students were talking to us about the ways they felt invisible as students of color in their schools when their curriculum, for example, didn't reflect them, or when they maybe like they talked about like, oh, we talk about Black History Month in February, but we never ever talk about like African American history ever throughout the rest of the school year. And so really having these intentional spaces where they can feel affirmed and valued. And they even talked about how they would like to have essentially affinity group spaces where they could talk to other students of color or have a communal space with their teachers of color to help them have a more positive school experience. And that will help them learn. And in this conversation around teacher retention would help them maybe consider returning as a teacher to a school in the future. So all that to say, definitely school culture is important, and students are really paying attention to how they are being treated, how the relationships they build with their educators, with their school leaders, in terms of having a positive environment and thinking about how we can support and retain teachers of color.
Thank you. And lastly, before we go to our questions from our participants, G, in your current work with Breakthrough, you help pre-service educators on their path on the way to the classroom. And do you have any data or any knowledge that suggests that the school environment has that impact on the recruitment and retention of educators, and particularly for those educators of color?
Yeah, absolutely. So Amber referenced the Great Ed Trust report, where it was referencing that teachers of color leave the profession for a number of reasons, including the negative environments that they're experiencing and the fact that they're feeling unsupported. McKinsey, even I think it was a couple of years now, wrote a report about why teachers leave the field, and they found that there's like well-being is definitely one reason why people leave the field. And for those that like said well-being was an issue, they asked, well, what is it about it? And they said it's because they have too much work to do and that there aren't enough teachers to carry the workload, so that like recruitment and retention of teachers are actually interrelated as well. when I think about some of the information that we get from Breakthrough, I always think about our program a little bit like a microcosm of like what it is like sort of in the larger field. And one interesting data point that I see in our data came from our recruitment survey. So we asked a group of teaching fellows why they applied to Breakthrough for the summer. And there are a number of reasons why they choose to join us, but one of the most interesting to me is that they apply because they know that they actually won't be alone in this journey. They know that they will be part of this larger experience with a cohort of other college students that are just like them. And being in that group of peers together really builds that community, especially as they're going through like this intense, unique experience together. And not only do they have a group of peers, but they're like receiving a lot of support along the way. So they're getting weeks of training before the program, they're getting professional development during and after the program, and they're also mentored and supported by an instructional coach who's like a professional full-time teacher that comes and supports them during that summertime, where they're reviewing lessons and they're observing classes and coaching and mentoring. And so the program has really high expectations, but is also a program that provides a lot of support. And all of that is necessary in order for our teaching fellows to have a meaningful experience. And quite often, about 20% of them come back any given year, because that's the hope, is that they come back and want to teach again with us for another summer, and that they're also inspired to go on to become teachers and enter the field as well. Ron talks a lot about structural things, and I completely agree with that. I would say that like we at Breakthrough, when we're thinking about like well-being and mental health in sort of structural ways, some other things that have emerged is like some of our sites have optional identity-based affinity groups. Amber, you talked about affinity groups. Those are led by our teaching fellows. Some of our program leadership encourage our teaching fellows to take self-care breaks. And for some of our sites, it's built into their day so that they are doing that. It is just sort of part of their day is to do that. And some of our sites are starting to more and more add counselors to their staff so that not only their students can access them, but the teaching fellows can also access them as they can talk to them about their challenges and things that they're experiencing in the summer program. And we as a program, we're still understanding what additional supports our teaching fellows need. We give surveys every year. I think data collection is really important to really understand what it is that folks who are teaching really need. And in that survey, we ask questions like whether or not stipends are adequate, how you are feeling in terms of social emotional growth. Are you able to access mental health resources when you need them? Like all of those things, all of those pieces of information we use to try to iterate and improve our program as we go along in ways to help support our fellows in a holistic way so that they can show up as their best selves throughout the summer.
Got you. Thank you. So as we move into this space to take questions from the chat, one already kind of came up, and Jamila spoke to my heart as a psychologist and thinking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And so for you all on the call, there's a question about like how can we make those base needs met? How can we meet those base needs if we understand that basically all the things that we talk about with students needing in schools and to be supported and be safe and things like that, teachers need those same things. So how can those like very, very basic needs be met inside of schools? And this is to whoever would like to take it.
I mean, I'll kick us off by a couple thoughts. I would say, I think that there are a lot of factors outside of a job that contribute to like how people show up. And I even think about things like, are we paying teachers enough so that they can live in the communities that they teach in so that they don't have to spend an hour or two commuting to and from? I think that like there's a lot of things that can actually be fixed and done. There's actions that can be made at sort of like a systemic level that I think can get to some of these other sort of basic things that our teachers need that they're bringing with them that we may not even see. And so, I think that like there are things that like sort of outside of the school, as Ron was saying, that can really get at that to help support our teachers even before they walk in the door.
And I would just add, I definitely agree with everything that G just mentioned. I think all of that is true. And I think one thing I would say too is to listen. One of the things we hear in our research is like with teachers is like people often assume that they know what the problem is. And so they're jumping to solutions without taking the step of listening to teachers and also students. And so when you make the space to really understand what school climate and culture looks like from the teacher perspective, from the student perspective, that's so helpful in diagnosing the problem and also finding the right solutions, just making sure we listen to teachers.
Got you. Yeah, so we're taking questions from the audience right now. Of course, I'll also mention that in the name of balance and meeting needs and well-being, Ron had to go pick up his daughters from school, so he'll still be here on the call, just not on camera. So if you have questions directly for him, he'll still be available to answer those. So please, anybody, questions for our panelists, questions is overall generally. And if not, of course, I have some still left. So we'll be good. And so while you all are typing, I'll throw one out there for us. We've had a lot of like conversation around what individual schools can do, right? I think there's a big thing out there because I imagine administrators at times will have these feelings of I can only do so much with what I have, right? And so I think there's a question out there about like how can legislators weigh in? How can they support the adoption or the implementation of these kinds of mental health supports and mindfulness practices in schools? What on the policy side, what can those folks do?
I'm certainly not like a policy expert, but I do, you know, I had the pleasure of actually going to Capitol Hill in the fall and advocating around diversity of in the teaching field. And, you know, the interesting thing is that, you know, members of Congress, a lot of them have this feeling that like schooling is really a local issue, right? And so for some members of Congress, they kind of like, they feel like education is definitely like a passion project. They like are interested in it. And then others who might be on a different side of the aisle might feel a little bit wary of it, saying it's a little bit more of a local issue. However, in those conversations, I thought it was really interesting that for those that tend to feel like schooling is a local issue, they started to become interested in the retention of teachers and the recruitment of teachers, because they are hearing from their constituents that there are schools that have no teachers, or like they're lacking in teachers, and their students and their children are suffering. And so I think one way of being able to advocate and position this seems to be sort of honing in on the idea that retention and recruitment of teachers is a major issue, and our members of Congress are hearing that, and also then being able to talk about how mental health and mindfulness is really sort of folded into like retaining and keeping our teachers. And I think that could be one strategy of thinking about it and talking about it.
Yeah, I would maybe add that I think it's important for district or state leaders to think about the way that they can support school leaders in trying to create affirming environments and to support the mental health of students and teachers. So, you know, having funds for the resources that a school leader might need, maybe providing things like technical assistance so that districts or schools have the actual capability to establish the right systems that can support their students and teachers. So making sure they're positioning themselves in ways that they can support the work that school leaders are doing or that they need to do in order to support teacher incident mental health. So funding, resources, and really prioritizing, I think, as you was saying, mental health and school environments, so that it's a very visible topic, and that they can provide support to schools in that way.
Yeah, I think I would just add, just to kind of to sum up a little bit too. I think two things that stick out to me is like at a very base level, we think about like the valuing of teachers of color, just period, point blank. And thinking about what does it actually mean to value people. We think about valuing folks with pizza parties and things, but we can also value them financially. We can also value them with the resources that are going to support their mental health and well-being, right? But the other thing I think too that is probably more low-hanging fruit for policy folks is to think about data too. And so we think about collecting data around recruitment and retention and hiring and things like that. But we can also make sure that we are taking like our surveys and our assessments very seriously around these issues around mental health and well-being as well. And so not just thinking about, are you satisfied with your experience, but actually trying to get a little bit deeper in terms of what we're asking teachers to get very rich information from them, so then that they can have the evidence they need to push these policies forward to those who need it. Again, asking for questions from the audience. Of course, we're getting towards time, but want to make sure you all have the space to of course add any comments, any questions that you have for our panel. Okay. As we see, start get some more trickling in. We've also kind of couched this in a conversation about the response or the kind of like the reaction that we've had to having like a post-ish COVID kind of schooling environment, right? And so given the reports of this like learning loss post-COVID, how can school communities leverage some of these mindfulness practices to support teacher retention and student learning?
That's a great question. I think in some ways, even just acknowledging that teaching is hard. It's a hard profession. It's one of the most rewarding, and it is also hard. I would say I was just recently at the American Education Research Association conference in Philly last month. And I think one of the things that was coming out in a lot of the sessions around supporting teachers was the need to even just acknowledge from the beginning, even like while teachers are like entering certification programs and like learning to become a teacher, even acknowledging the realities of what it's like to be a teacher was really important. And then also starting to have some of those hard conversations around like how you deal, like how you support yourself and how you like use the resources that are available to you even before you actually enter the field is one of those things that I think came up a lot in that conference. And something else that came out in the conference, there was an interesting paper that I had heard about where there was a professional development that was being done with a group of teachers. And during that session, there was a point to have those teachers care for each other. So like the teachers, like part of the session was like, who cares for the teachers? It's like the other teachers are actually caring for each other in this professional development, and they're using that professional development space to talk about those practices of mindfulness, and then also sharing like what their day-to-day experiences were like. And it turned out that professional development was one of the most impactful sessions that they had in their whole teaching careers. Like they had sort of said that in their research and things. And so I think that even building in mindfulness practices in existing structures, I think is also a mechanism to do this. But then also even starting way before, just to prepare folks for what the realities of being a teacher are like, are potential strategies too.
Great, and we did have a question pop in the chat. What are you all's thoughts about the existence of school districts that may partner with local universities to address some of these mental health gaps and retention issues?
Yeah, I definitely think that university and district partnerships are a unique and like a very promising lever for addressing mental health. I think I am thinking of an example in terms of teacher diversity in Pennsylvania. So not exactly mental health, but where the Center for Black Educator Development, the Pennsylvania Educator Diversity Consortium, I think is the name, partner with school districts around like culturally responsive teaching in Pennsylvania, and also like collaborating to help retain and recruit and retain teachers of color. And that work was very successful. And so I think like leveraging partnerships in other ways like mental health is also a very promising strategy based on that. But I definitely think that that's a good opportunity to increase access to resources or personnel. So partnering with universities and school districts is I think a really good strategy.
Got you. Thank you. And so we're almost at time, but wanted to lift this comment from Danielle because I want to make sure we all are seen and visible. So just about the acknowledgement from administrators that teaching is hard. Also acknowledging that I think especially in society today, how we are much more diverse and much more close in proximity to one another, that teaching children and dealing with folks from a variety or a myriad of backgrounds is going to be challenging, even more so than it was decades before. And so there's just so much for us to get right. And it's not just about getting through a lesson in the curriculum. So for sure, we appreciate that. Just with our last couple minutes of time that we have for you all, our panelists, in 1 minute or less, can you tell us what does it look like for mental health, mindfulness, and well-being to be supported in every public school? How might that impact us in the real world or in an ideal world?
I can kick us off. I think we'd see productive teaching and productive learning. I think we'd see joy. I would love to see vulnerability given without consequence or judgment, and support given without consequence or judgment. I also think discipline would look a lot different than it does right now. And the hope would be that young people come out of schooling feeling safe and whole, and that hopefully that'll start to change perceptions around the teaching profession and give it the respect that it deserves.
Yeah, I would just say, kind of echo what G said and say that I think a recognition, empathy, and understanding of students from different backgrounds, and understanding that students have different needs and teachers have different needs, and have schools being a place where those needs can be met and people from different backgrounds can feel safe and affirmed, and that will enable learning to happen in a meaningful way, in a sustaining way, and an engaging way. That's what I would love to see happen. Mental health supported so that students and teachers, school leaders are thriving and safe and affirmed.
Hey, folks, coming off mute. I don't know if I have anything extra to add from the great thoughts that Amber and G shared, but I think the idea that schools are one where one's multitude of identities are truly celebrated so that you can feel like you belong, safe, affirmed. I think a lot of the things that we talked about right now, that would be just an incredible outcome for our school systems in America, because right now I think it happens in pockets. We can learn for those pockets, but in this world where those things exist more, I think we have a much stronger, more vibrant society.
Got you, thank you. And also, I'd be remiss not to lift the comment from the Q&A section that Jan rose. She just said that including teachers in the decision-making process at all levels of policy is critical to the well-being of teachers. And so especially understanding that you have students right now who are being discouraged from entering the field, you want to make sure that teachers have that support, that they are a part of that process. If there's nothing else, I just want to really quickly thank our panel for their participation, their wise words for this content. Thank the Hunt Institute for bringing us all together to talk about this very, very important topic. And so for you all, could you just throw some clapping emojis in the chat for our panel for Hunt Institute? We thank you all for being here.
Perfect. And Dr. Dixon, thank you for moderating. G, Amber, Ron, thank you for your time as well. I also would invite you to keep an eye out for our upcoming June webinar, which will be on the high quality and innovative pathways to strengthen the teachers of color pipeline. So we'll have breakthrough that one as well as the Assistant Secretary of Education, Rodriguez. He'll be there as well. So we thank you all. Look out for an invitation as well as key takeaways and the recording of this incredible panel. So if you do want to share with colleagues or folks who weren't able to join live, feel free once you get that between about 1 to 2 weeks. Not only the key takeaways, which will have a summary of what was said today, but also the recording of the great things that were said today as well. And so we encourage you to share that with folks who weren't able to attend, but might be very interested in that. We'll see you in June. And until then, thank you all to our panelists, our moderator, Dr. Dixon. Thank you. Have a wonderful afternoon and a better week.